Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. Beneath the glare of a merciless sun, Libya stretches endlessly, a vast ocean of sand where human ambition seems absurd. Here dunes roll like frozen waves broken only by lonely oases clinging to life. For centuries, the Sahara has dictated the rhythm of existence, tribes moving with the wind caravans trailing lines of dust, and cities built like mirages on the edge of survival. This is a land that remembers every empire that tried to tame it and everyone that failed. When the Italians arrived in the early 20th century, they carved roads through the desert and built whitewashed cities along the coast, but they never conquered its soul. Decades later, when independence came in 1951, Libya was one of the poorest nations on earth, scarred by colonial wars, forgotten by history. Its people lived scattered between the Mediterranean and the dunes, bound not by nationality, but by tribe lineage and the memory of survival. Then the sands revealed their secret. Beneath this barren landscape lay vast rivers of oil, ancient sunlight trapped underground. In a few short years, Libya transformed from destitution to wealth. Black gold flowed through pipelines to Europe, and dollars poured into the coffers of the new kingdom. Skyscrapers rose beside crumbling mosques. The glow of electric light replaced lanterns in coastal towns. Yet for many Libyans, the promise of prosperity remained distant, a shimmering mirage. The monarchy led by King Idris favored his own Senussi tribe and the eastern region of Cyrenaica. Corruption and nepotism spread like sand in a storm. Villages in the desert still lacked clean water, while elites dined in imported marble halls. To the young men in the army barracks, this injustice felt like betrayal. Among them was a 27-year-old officer from a Bedouin tent near Sirte, a man named Muammar Gaddafi. He had grown up herding goats beneath skies so wide they seemed to swallow the earth. To him, Libya's oil wealth was both a blessing and a curse, a reminder that foreign hands could shape the nation's destiny. Inspired by the pan-Arab nationalism of Egypt's Nasser, he dreamed of a Libya that was pure, united, and free from Western control. In the stillness of the desert, he found clarity. In the barracks, he found followers. On the night of September 1st, 1969, while the king was abroad receiving medical treatment, Gaddafi's small group of officers seized control. Tanks rolled into Tripoli before dawn. By sunrise, the Libyan monarchy had fallen without a shot fired. From radio towers across the country came a calm young voice announcing the birth of the Libyan Arab Republic. In a single night, centuries of monarchy, tribal rule, and colonial residue were swept away by a man who believed destiny had chosen him. The new regime promised revolution, unity, socialism, Arab pride. To the poor and disenfranchised, it sounded like redemption. In the mosques, the imams blessed the young colonel. In the villages, men shouted his name. But beyond the celebration, the desert remained unchanged, its silence deep, its patience infinite. It had seen empires rise and vanish into dust. And as the morning sun broke over Tripoli, it looked down upon yet another ruler who believed he could outlast the sands. The age of the colonel had begun, and with it, the long shadow of his dream. In the first days after the coup, Libya awoke to a new kind of silence. Gone was the royal anthem. In its place, the calm voice of a young colonel echoed through every transistor radio. Muammar Gaddafi promised liberation from corruption, foreign influence, and the old order. He spoke of justice and dignity of a Libya ruled not by kings or colonizers, but by its own people. For a population long starved of pride, his words felt like water in the desert. Gaddafi dressed, simply slept in tents, and quoted the Quran with fiery conviction. His followers saw him as both prophet and soldier, a man molded by the desert itself. To the outside world, he was a curiosity, neither monarch nor elected leader, but something new, a revolutionary wrapped in a Bedouin cloak. He called his movement al-Fateh, meaning the conqueror, as though history itself had yielded to his will. Yet beneath the revolutionary zeal, the foundations of a dictatorship were already forming. Within months, political parties were banned. The press became an instrument of adoration. Critics vanished into desert prisons. Gaddafi proclaimed that Libya no longer needed a parliament or constitution. The people would govern directly through local committees. He named this system Jamahiriya, state of the masses. But in practice, every committee answered to him. In speeches that stretched for hours, he outlined his Third International theory, a blend of socialism, Islam, and personal invention. The Green Book, published in 1975, became his scripture. It rejected capitalism and communism alike, arguing that true democracy existed when people ruled themselves without intermediaries. To question it was heresy. School children memorized passages as if they were sacred text. Oil wealth flooded Libya during these years, and Gaddafi used it to transform the country. The once sleepy desert kingdom became a laboratory for his grand experiments: free housing, education, and health care. Vast irrigation projects pulling water from aquifers deep beneath the Sahara. For a time it seemed to work. Illiteracy plummeted. Roads reached forgotten towns. Libya's per capita income soared. But the benefits were uneven, and loyalty determined who prospered. Gaddafi's tribal allies filled key posts in the military and government. Those from rival tribes were quietly sidelined or exiled. He abolished traditional tribal councils, yet he ruled by exploiting their rivalries, turning unity into dependence. His revolution was not built on equality, but on surveillance and fear. Foreign diplomats called him unpredictable. His own ministers called him brother leader. He relished both titles. At international summits, he denounced imperialism, colonialism, and Western arrogance. He funded liberation movements from Ireland to the Philippines, seeing himself as the guardian of anti-imperial struggle. Yet at home, his paranoia deepened. He once ordered an entire army unit to fire on the barracks of soldiers suspected of plotting against him. None survived. For ordinary Libyans, Gaddafi became both savior and jailer. Streets bore his slogans. Walls carried his portraits. To praise him was to be patriotic. To question him was to disappear. But still many believed in his promise. They saw in him a man who had given Libya a voice loud, defiant, and impossible to ignore. In the early 1970s, as the desert winds howled across his homeland, Gaddafi stood before the ruins of a Roman amphitheater in Leptis Magna and declared the West once ruled here. Today the sons of the desert have returned. The applause thundered against the ancient stones. Yet even then the echoes hinted at prophecy for the same ruins that once celebrated emperors would one day remember his fall. By the late 1970s, Libya stood alone, rich, defiant, and increasingly dangerous. Gaddafi had turned his revolution into a theater of ideology, and the world was his audience. He styled himself not as a president, but as a guide of the revolution, a man above the machinery of the state. Foreign leaders were alternately charmed and horrified. To his admirers, he was a symbol of post-colonial pride. To his enemies, a reckless firebrand draped in desert robes. He poured Libya's oil wealth into causes he called anti-imperialist. Money and weapons flowed to the Irish Republican Army, the Red Brigades in Italy, and militants in Africa and the Middle East. He dreamed of uniting the Arab world under his leadership, but his proposals for mergers with Egypt, Tunisia, even Syria collapsed amid suspicion and laughter. Soon no Arab government trusted him, yet his ambition only grew. Inside Libya, the cult of personality hardened into a fortress. The revolutionary committees, dressed in green uniforms, patrolled universities and offices, rooting out dissent. At dawn, executions were broadcast live on state television, a grim warning to anyone who dared speak freely. The phrase, "the people's power," became a bitter joke, whispered only in private. The oil that once promised freedom now financed fear. Abroad, Gaddafi's confrontations escalated. In 1984, his agents murdered a British policewoman outside the Libyan embassy in London. 2 years later, Libyan intelligence was linked to the bombing of a West Berlin nightclub frequented by U.S. soldiers. President Reagan called him the mad dog of the Middle East. American jets soon thundered over Tripoli and Benghazi, striking his compound in retaliation. The attack killed dozens, including Gaddafi's adopted daughter. The colonel survived, and he used the air raid to fortify his myth. On television, he appeared in flowing robes, cradling the body of his dead child beneath a shattered ceiling, vowing vengeance. For years afterward, that image lingered, a father and a martyr framed in concrete dust and smoke. His enemies had meant to humble him. Instead, they made him immortal in the eyes of many who hated the West. Yet the isolation that followed began to rot Libya from within. Sanctions cut off trade and investment. The country's infrastructure aged without repair. Planes rusted on airstrips. Machinery fell silent in half-built factories. A generation of Libyan youth grew up restless and jobless, raised on promises that never materialized. Meanwhile, Gaddafi grew erratic. One day, he denounced capitalism. The next, he courted Western oil firms. By the 1990s, Libya had become a paradox, a nation of vast wealth where people queued for bread, a country with the world's largest irrigation project, but no clean governance, a state feared abroad and suffocated at home. Even his allies began to whisper of fatigue. The guide no longer inspired, he endured. When the Soviet Union fell, Gaddafi lost his ideological anchor. For a brief moment, he seemed to soften. He released political prisoners, allowed foreign inspectors to visit, and in 2003 accepted responsibility for the Lockerbie bombing, paying billions in reparations. The world took notice. Western leaders shook his hand, oil companies returned, sanctions lifted. For the first time in decades, Libya was being welcomed back into the fold. But the years of isolation had changed nothing beneath the surface. The security state remained omnipresent. Tribal loyalties festered under the facade of unity. The oil profits, instead of rebuilding, lined the pockets of the loyal. Libya glittered at night with neon and oil flames, but its people were growing restless. In the palaces of Tripoli, Gaddafi spoke of destiny, of his role as Africa's visionary. In the cafes of Benghazi, people spoke of hunger, humiliation, and fear. Two worlds existed in the same land, one of privilege and power, the other of dust and despair. And between them, the old desert waited silent, patient, remembering. For the man who once promised liberation had become the very tyrant he had overthrown. The revolution's fire was fading, and its ashes were beginning to stir. By the dawn of the new millennium, Libya seemed on paper to be thriving. Skyscrapers pierced the horizon of Tripoli. New highways cut through the sand. The state boasted free education, free health care, and one of the highest literacy rates in Africa. Life expectancy reached 74 years. The World Bank praised its GDP per capita over $16,000. To the outside observer, it was a story of rebirth, proof that Gaddafi's Jamahiriya had delivered progress. But to live inside this illusion was another matter. Beneath the gloss of numbers, daily life for most Libyans remained stagnant. A bloated public sector employed the majority, offering salaries so meager that many took second jobs in the shadow economy. Corruption was everywhere. Officials demanded bribes for housing, for permits, for medical treatment. Those without connections waited years for apartments that never materialized. Libya's wealth, though immense, flowed like water through sand, disappearing into the pockets of the few. Oil was both the nation's lifeblood and its curse. 95% of the economy depended on it. The government built no industries, trained no craftsmen, nurtured no innovation. The desert, once empty and pure, became littered with half-finished projects, monuments to ambition without purpose. Farmers abandoned their fields for government jobs that required no labor. Students memorized slogans instead of skills. The country had become rich but hollow. Among the youth, frustration turned to quiet rage. Unemployment hovered near 30%. University graduates returned home to idleness, trapped between a regime that demanded loyalty and a future that offered none. In Tripoli, graffiti appeared on walls at night, then vanished by morning, erased by authorities before dawn. Yet whispers grew louder. Why do we live poor in a rich land? In the eastern region of Cyrenaica, resentment ran deepest. It was there, in the dusty city of Benghazi, that Gaddafi's revolution had first found its footing decades earlier. Now it felt forgotten. Government projects favored the West. Infrastructure crumbled in the East. Old tribal wounds reopened. The people spoke of neglect, of arrogance, of a leader who no longer listened. And above it all, Gaddafi watched. He was aging now, his black curls streaked with gray, his once youthful fire replaced by suspicion. He surrounded himself with family and loyalists, insulated from the realities of the streets. His speeches grew longer, stranger, mixing mysticism and threats. At times he seemed less a ruler than a man haunted by the echoes of his own revolution. Still, the illusion persisted. The state television showed smiling farmers, new hospitals, and happy children reciting passages from the Green Book. The leader toured desert towns in his tent, speaking of purity and destiny. But when the cameras turned off, the motorcade sped back to palaces guarded by foreign-trained mercenaries. Libya, like its desert, shimmered with false promise, a mirage of stability shimmering over the heat of decay. And as the world beyond began to stir with its own restless energy, revolutions in the making, ideas spreading like wildfire, the mirage would not hold for long. In the quiet evenings of late 2010, as the call to prayer echoed across Benghazi's streets, few could imagine how quickly that stillness would break. But in the air, something was changing, an unease that even the regime's secret police could not silence. The desert once again was about to awaken. It began quietly, almost invisibly, like the first breath of a sandstorm far on the horizon. In late 2010, the Arab world trembled as Tunisia's dictator fell to a wave of street protests. Egypt soon followed. Across the region, people long suffocated by fear began to find their voices. And in Libya, where silence had reigned for 40 years, that sound carried across the desert like a warning. The first protests came not from radicals or soldiers, but from ordinary citizens in Benghazi. They wanted homes, jobs, and dignity. The spark was small. A human rights lawyer named Fatih Terbil, who represented families of prisoners killed in Gaddafi's jails, was arrested on February 15, 2011. Within hours, crowds gathered outside the police headquarters demanding his release. The police opened fire. The crowd grew, and something broke that could not be mended. By the next morning, thousands filled the streets, men, women, even children carrying the old tricolor flag of the pre-Gaddafi monarchy. They chanted for freedom, for bread, for an end to corruption. Videos began to circulate online, shaky and raw, showing unarmed civilians running from gunfire. The world watched as Libya, long thought immune to rebellion, began to burn. The regime responded with the only language it knew: violence. Security forces fired into the crowds with live ammunition. Snipers appeared on rooftops. Hospitals overflowed with the wounded. Amnesty International would later estimate that over 200 civilians were killed in the first days alone. Still, the protests spread from Benghazi to Al-Baida, Misrata, and Tripoli itself. For the first time, the air of fear that had cloaked Libya for decades began to lift. Soldiers defected rather than fire on their own people. Police stations were torched, army depots seized. The slogans shifted from reform to freedom and finally to down with the regime. The dream of revolution long buried beneath silence and sand had returned. In Tripoli, Gaddafi appeared on television furious and disbelieving. Dressed in flowing brown robes, he shouted beneath a green umbrella, declaring himself the eternal leader of a united Libya. "Who are you?" he demanded of the protesters. "Who gave you orders?" His words were defiance and denial, wrapped together, a man raging against the storm he had unleashed. But the storm was already spreading. His promises of reform of new housing and billions in state aid came too late. The people no longer wanted promises. They wanted change, and they were ready to die for it. In the eastern cities, protesters seized government buildings. In Benghazi, the local police joined them. By the end of February, much of Cyrenaica was in open revolt. Those who survived the first massacres buried their dead in mass graves beneath olive trees. Mothers wept beside bloodied flags. The revolution had found its first martyrs, and with them, its momentum. In the nights that followed, Benghazi became a city of whispers and gunfire. Young men took up arms, many using weapons scavenged from abandoned bases. Homemade checkpoints appeared on roads leading into town. The green flags of Gaddafi's regime vanished, replaced by the red, black, and green of the old monarchy. To outsiders, it looked like chaos. To Libyans, it felt like awakening. Under the faint glow of burning tires, one protester scrawled on a wall, "We are not afraid anymore." And for the first time in living memory, that was true. As February 2011 unfolded, Libya's rebellion spread like wildfire across the country's fractured map. What began as scattered protests now surged into full-scale defiance. In Benghazi, entire army units switched sides. Their commanders, once loyal to the regime, declared allegiance to the revolution. Police officers tore the green crest from their uniforms and joined the crowds. Checkpoints once guarded by the regime now flew the rebel flag. The eastern half of Libya had broken away, and the government in Tripoli felt the earth shifting beneath its feet. Inside Gaddafi's fortress compound of Bab al-Azizia, the colonel raged at betrayal. The man who had ruled Libya longer than most of its people had been alive now faced his greatest fear, a divided country. His speeches grew more erratic, half threats, half hallucinations. "We will cleanse Libya house by house," he shouted from the balcony, fist raised against a phantom enemy. He vowed to fight until the last drop of blood. But his voice no longer carried the weight of destiny. It sounded desperate. Meanwhile, in the east, a new authority began to take shape. On February 27th, prominent defectors, politicians, soldiers, and tribal elders announced the formation of the National Transitional Council (NTC) in Benghazi. Their message was simple and direct. They would represent the true will of the Libyan people. For the first time in decades, Libya had an opposition government. In those first chaotic weeks, optimism and fear walked hand in hand. Rebels captured weapons, depots, airports, and border crossings. Cities like Tobruk, Derna, and Ajdabia declared themselves free. On the streets, teenagers carried Kalashnikovs that seemed too heavy for their shoulders. Engineers became soldiers, and mechanics turned into field commanders. Every man fought for something different: tribe faith, vengeance, but all believed Gaddafi's time was ending. Yet the regime still held the West. Tripoli remained under Gaddafi's grip, its neighborhoods divided between loyalty and quiet resistance. State television aired endless footage of supporters waving green flags and chanting his name, but the fear was palpable. Secret police prowled the streets. Families whispered before speaking. Anyone accused of aiding the rebels vanished into detention centers. For a brief, surreal moment, it seemed as though the revolution might end before it truly began. Gaddafi's most trusted generals regrouped in the desert, preparing to strike back. But fate turned against him. His interior minister, Abdul Fattah Yunus, once among his closest allies, defected to the rebels, taking his soldiers and armories with him. His defection sent shockwaves through the army. Entire battalions began to waver. In some cases, soldiers simply melted away, choosing not to fight for a cause they no longer believed in. By early March, eastern Libya was entirely under rebel control. Tanks painted with graffiti rolled through Benghazi's streets as children waved flags from rooftops. Journalists arrived from across the world to witness what looked like a triumph of courage over tyranny. Yet even in their victory, the rebels sensed the storm that was coming. Gaddafi was regrouping his loyalists around Tripoli and Sirte. He still commanded elite units, foreign mercenaries, and the remnants of the Air Force. The man who had ruled for 42 years was wounded but not defeated. In the rebel-held East, makeshift councils debated over what to do next. Should they march on Tripoli or fortify their cities? The answer came soon enough in the roar of engines and the distant thunder of artillery. Gaddafi's forces were moving east, reclaiming town after town in a ferocious counteroffensive. But for a brief golden window, Libya's east believed it had taken its future into its own hands. Crowds in Benghazi sang under the night sky, their voices rising above the ruins. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of gunfire echoed, faint but inevitable, a reminder that freedom once seized must be defended. The revolution had won its first battle. The war for Libya was only beginning. Gaddafi's counterattack came with the force of vengeance. In March 2011, his armored columns surged eastward along the coast, reclaiming town after town. To the outside world, it seemed the revolution might be crushed before it could take root. To Gaddafi, it was a campaign of survival and punishment. He unleashed his loyal brigades units, commanded by his sons and fortified with mercenaries from Chad and Mali. Their tanks rumbled through the desert highways like steel serpents, leaving charred villages and fear in their wake. The cities that had dared to rebel were made examples. In Zawiya, government artillery reduced apartment blocks to rubble. In Misrata, snipers targeted anyone who moved ambulances, journalists, even children. Reporters who managed to enter the besieged city described streets littered with bodies, blood seeping into the dust. Misrata, the third largest city in Libya, had become a symbol of defiance and of horror. Inside his Tripoli compound, Gaddafi appeared on television draped in brown robes, waving a fist at the camera. His eyes gleamed with fury. "We will find you in your closets in your homes, and we will have no mercy," he shouted. The speech, intended to terrify the rebels, instead united the world against him. For those who had once seen him as eccentric, he now appeared deranged, a dictator, openly threatening to annihilate his own people. As his forces pushed toward Benghazi, panic swept through the east. The rebels, barely organized and armed with scavenged weapons, struggled to hold the line. Many of them were mechanics teachers or teenagers who had never seen combat. They fought from the backs of pickup trucks, firing anti-aircraft guns mounted on rusted frames. Against Gaddafi's tanks and rockets, their courage was their only defense. The National Transitional Council, realizing its days might be numbered, turned outward. From makeshift offices in Benghazi, diplomats and activists reached out to the international community begging for intervention. They argued that Gaddafi's advance was not just a military operation, but a massacre in progress. Their plea was simple: close the skies before we are destroyed. As Benghazi braced for assault, civilians fled by the thousands. Cars jammed the coastal highway, families piled atop one another with what little they could carry. The air reeked of gasoline and fear. Rebel commanders promised to make a final stand, but everyone knew they were outmatched. Western reporters began to speak of an impending bloodbath. If Gaddafi reaches Benghazi, one said grimly, we will see another Rwanda. Meanwhile, within Gaddafi's shrinking circle, cracks appeared. Some of his ministers fled abroad. Others vanished entirely. Even as his army advanced, his regime was rotting from within. Decades of fear had ensured obedience, but not loyalty. Still, the colonel pressed forward. His tanks rolled to within hours of Benghazi. The desert sky glowed red from artillery flashes, the horizon trembling with explosions. For the rebels huddled inside the city, the sound was the drumbeat of doom. They prepared to fight street by street, knowing that if the city fell, the revolution would die with it. Then in the final hours before the assault, fate intervened, not from the desert, but from the sky. News spread that the United Nations was meeting in New York to vote on a resolution that could change everything: authorization for a no-fly zone and for all necessary measures to protect Libyan civilians. In Benghazi, people listened to crackling radios, breath held in suspense. And somewhere above the Mediterranean, the pilots of a NATO task force received their orders. The desert storm Gaddafi had unleashed was about to turn against him. On March 17, 2011, the fate of Libya shifted in a single vote. In the marble chambers of the United Nations, the Security Council passed Resolution 1973, authorizing a no-fly zone and the use of all necessary measures to protect civilians. It was a rare moment of unity in a divided world. France and Britain led the charge. The United States lent its air power. Even the Arab League, wary of Western meddling, endorsed intervention. For once the international community agreed the colonel had gone too far. In Benghazi, the news arrived like a gust of hope. Families wept in the streets. Mosque loudspeakers announced prayers of gratitude. Yet the relief was tinged with fear because Gaddafi's tanks were already on the outskirts of the city. That very night, his artillery began pounding the suburbs, shells tearing through apartment blocks. Rebel fighters scrambled to defend their lines. They had only hours left. Then just before dawn, on March 19th, the desert sky cracked open. The first French jets roared overhead, streaking low over the burning fields. Moments later, explosions bloomed along the highway, outside Benghazi, columns of black smoke rising where Gaddafi's armor had been. For the rebels on the ground, it felt like divine intervention. Cheers and gunfire echoed through the city as one of the world's most powerful alliances entered the war. The operation, codenamed Odyssey Dawn, was swift and brutal. In 10 days, NATO aircraft flew more than 1,000 sorties, obliterating radar stations, missile batteries, and tank columns. The Libyan Air Force, once Gaddafi's pride, was reduced to silence. From that moment on, the skies belonged to the coalition. But the mandate was clear: no foreign boots on Libyan soil. NATO could destroy, but not conquer. If Gaddafi were to fall, it would have to be by Libyan hands. The world would open the gates of war, but the Libyans would have to walk through them alone. Across the Mediterranean, Western leaders framed the intervention as moral necessity. We had to act, declared President Obama. We could not stand by and watch a massacre. In Paris, President Sarkozy called it a new dawn for freedom, but not everyone was convinced. Critics warned of another Iraq, another foreign war born of idealism and oil. Meanwhile, the battlefield changed shape. With the skies cleared of Gaddafi's jets, the rebels began to move again. Foreign nations rushed to arm and trained them quietly and through back channels. Qatar, a tiny Gulf state, sent shipments of rifles, ammunition, and anti-tank missiles, smuggling them through Egyptian ports. Sudan opened its airspace for supply runs. Western advisors whispered strategies in the shadows. Inside Libya, the tide was turning, but the cost was immense. Bombs fell on loyalist convoys, but also on the highways where refugees fled. The lines between soldier and civilian blurred in the smoke. Gaddafi, undeterred, vowed to fight until every Libyan is cleansed of traitors. In Tripoli, his voice still boomed across radio waves, defiant as ever. You think you can defeat me with your planes? I am in the hearts of millions. Yet even those hearts were beginning to falter. The images of burned towns of women carrying children through rubble were too much. International aid organizations warned of a humanitarian disaster. Europe braced for an exodus across the sea. The Arab world watched transfixed as one of its longest ruling leaders faced annihilation from both inside and out. In Benghazi, the rebels celebrated under foreign skies. Their cheers mixed with the thunder of airstrikes, a symphony of liberation and violence. They believed history was finally on their side, but no one yet understood how long the war would drag on, nor how the foreign hands that saved Libya would soon shape its fate. For now, under the roar of jet engines and the glare of burning oil, Libya stood between two worlds, one dying in smoke, the other still unborn. The air war began with precision and fury. On March 19, 2011, Western warplanes filled the Libyan sky, streaking in from carriers and bases across the Mediterranean. Cruise missiles rained down on radar sites, airfields, and anti-aircraft guns. For the first time in months, the rebels looked up and saw not the shadow of Gaddafi's jets, but the contrails of allies. Operation Odyssey Dawn had begun. To the outside world, the intervention appeared surgical. To those on the ground, it was apocalyptic. The air throbbed with the roar of engines and the concussive thump of explosions. Outside Benghazi, Gaddafi's armored columns were caught in the open dozens of tanks and trucks consumed in pillars of smoke. The foreign planes are striking them, shouted a rebel commander over the radio. God is great. His voice broke mid-transmission, drowned out by the sound of an airstrike tearing the earth apart. In Tripoli, the colonel watched from his compound as the night sky flashed like lightning. His green banners fluttered above walls, trembling from distant detonations. He appeared again on state television, shaking his fist, denouncing NATO as crusaders, imperialists, murderers. His rhetoric no longer inspired. It felt like a ghost clinging to power. Yet for his followers, his defiance was intoxicating. Propaganda broadcasts showed loyal crowds dancing in the streets, chanting his name beneath anti-aircraft fire. The illusion of invincibility was fading, but not yet gone. For NATO, the mission was clear and limited: neutralize Gaddafi's ability to kill civilians. No troops on the ground, no occupation. The coalition would fight from the air and let the Libyans fight on the ground. But reality was messier. Without coordination, rebel offensives turned chaotic. Fighters in sandals and mismatched uniforms drove battered trucks toward the front, shouting, firing wildly into the desert. Western journalists called them the Toyota Army. Foreign support soon expanded beyond bombs. In secret, intelligence officers arrived in Benghazi to advise rebel leaders. France and Britain supplied encrypted radios, body armor, and night vision gear. Qatar went further, sending advisors and, according to whispers, even soldiers. Their cargo planes delivered thousands of tons of weapons. To the rebels, every crate offloaded was a lifeline. To Gaddafi, each one was proof of a global conspiracy. In Misrata, the fighting reached biblical levels of suffering. The city, cut off and surrounded, endured daily bombardments. Water lines were severed. Electricity failed. Residents used shattered bathtubs to collect rainwater. Doctors performed amputations by flashlight. Misrata is dying, read one message smuggled out on a satellite phone: "But we will not surrender." NATO airstrikes hit Gaddafi's artillery outside the city, but every time a cannon fell silent, another took its place. The siege stretched from days to weeks, then to months. Across Libya, the war drew lines that cut through families, tribes, and generations. Fathers fought sons. Neighbors turned against neighbors. The green flag of the regime and the red-black-green of the rebels fluttered in the same wind symbols of two irreconcilable futures. And yet amid the horror, something shifted. Each passing week drained Gaddafi's resources and morale. Sanctions tightened, oil exports halted. His generals, once proud in tailored uniforms, now issued orders from bunkers lit by generators. In the streets of Tripoli, whispers began to spread of defections, of betrayal, of the inevitable. In Benghazi, the rebels celebrated each victory broadcast on satellite television. But beneath the cheers, exhaustion crept in. Many had not been paid in months. Ammunition ran low. Their hospitals were overwhelmed. Still, the belief held firm: if they could survive Misrata, if they could hold the east, the dictator would eventually fall. Far above, unseen in the stratosphere, a NATO pilot banked his jet over the smoking coast and looked down at a land burning from within. To him, it was coordinates and targets. To those below, it was the rewriting of history, one airstrike at a time. On the coast of the Mediterranean, Misrata was once a quiet port of traders and fishermen, known for its markets and shipyards. By spring 2011, it had become the beating heart of Libya's revolution and the crucible of its suffering. When Gaddafi's tanks surrounded the city, cutting it off from both east and west, Misrata found itself alone. No escape, no reinforcements, just a city of 500,000 souls trapped between the sea and an army determined to erase them. The siege began with artillery. Each morning, the horizon flashed white, and then the earth shook. Shells fell on schools, hospitals, mosques. The markets where families once haggled over fish now filled with the sound of sirens and screams. Snipers perched on rooftops, picking off anyone who dared to move. Even children fetching water became targets. In one neighborhood, residents painted Sniper Alley on the walls in red, as if naming the street might make the terror less arbitrary. Rebels fought back with whatever they had: hunting rifles, stolen machine guns, and improvised rockets built from pipes. They fought from alleyways and rooftops, moving through holes blasted in walls to avoid open streets. The city became a labyrinth of barricades and fire. Every house turned into a fortress, every block a battlefield. Misrata's fighters adopted a grim motto: "We either live free or die here." The port became the city's lifeline. Under constant bombardment, small boats slipped through the naval blockade at night, bringing in medicine, food, and ammunition. Volunteers risked their lives steering through the dark, guided only by the faint glow of burning oil tanks onshore. Some never returned. When the port was hit by rockets, hundreds rushed to unload supplies anyway, carrying boxes through flames as explosions shook the docks. Western journalists compared Misrata to Stalingrad: the same desperation, the same defiance, the same sense that a city's fate had become the world's conscience. NATO aircraft patrolled above striking loyalist positions when they could, but the enemy was too close. The fighting was intimate, brutal, measured in meters. Every victory was paid for with blood. As the weeks dragged on, the city's hospitals overflowed. Doctors worked in hallways, on stairwells, on floors slick with blood. The dead were buried in playgrounds when cemeteries became unreachable. One surgeon, his face gray from exhaustion, told a visiting reporter, "We've stopped counting the bodies. It's easier that way." Yet amid the horror, Misrata refused to fall. The people endured on will alone. By May, after nearly 3 months under siege, the defenders launched a final desperate counterattack. Supported by NATO airstrikes, they struck west along Tripoli Street, the city's ruined artery. House by house, they pushed Gaddafi's troops back. When the last loyalist stronghold fell, residents flooded into the open for the first time in weeks. Some wept, others simply stared at the skyline, dazed by the silence that followed. Misrata had survived, but at a terrible price: more than 1,000 civilians, dead, entire districts reduced to ash. For Gaddafi, Misrata's fall was more than a military defeat. It was a wound to his myth. The brother leader, who once claimed to embody Libya's unity, had now bombarded its own heart into rubble. His soldiers retreated west, leaving behind burnt tanks and broken promises. The rebels called it divine justice. Gaddafi called it treason. Yet, even as Misrata licked its wounds, the war was far from over. To the south, in the Nafusa Mountains, another front was awakening. Rebel fighters hidden among the rocky ridges were preparing to descend on the capital. Tripoli, the seat of Gaddafi's power, was next. The desert winds carried the smell of smoke out to sea. Beneath it lay the silence of a city that had endured the unendurable. Misrata's defiance had become a legend, and legends once born do not die easily. Summer came to Libya like a fever. The air shimmered over the desert, heavy with smoke and dust, as the war entered its 5th month. Gaddafi's forces were bleeding from 100 wounds. The NATO blockade strangled his supply lines. Oil revenues had vanished. Sanctions froze billions in foreign accounts. Once fearsome brigades now scavenged for fuel, their convoys reduced to half-functioning trucks. The colonel's speeches grew erratic. He raged about betrayal conspiracies and divine vengeance. But for the first time in decades, his words inspired fear, only among the loyal, not the world. Misrata's victory had ignited something profound. The city that refused to die had shown the rest of Libya that Gaddafi could be defeated. From the mountains of Nafusa to the oases of the South Rebellion spread like wildfire. The Nafusa Range, rugged, ancient, and home to tribes long mistrusted by the regime, became the next crucible. Hidden among the canyons, small bands of rebels trained with foreign instructors, their weapons freshly arrived from secret supply lines through Tunisia. They prepared for one objective: Tripoli. By July, NATO intensified its air campaign. Each day, coalition jets tore across the skies, striking command bunkers, ammunition depots, and military convoys. The sound of war became constant, a low thunder above the dunes. At night, flashes of light dotted the horizon where bombs found their targets. Gaddafi's defenses thinned. His command centers were reduced to rubble. Even the capital felt the tremors. Tripoli's residents woke to the sound of distant explosions and the flicker of power cuts. The illusion of invulnerability had vanished. Inside the rebel camps, there was both exhilaration and exhaustion. Fighters who had once been mechanics or teachers now called themselves brigades. They lacked discipline, but not resolve. Their weapons were mismatched, their trucks riddled with bullet holes, yet morale was unshakable. "Tripoli is waiting for us," one fighter told a journalist. "It's been waiting for 40 years. The world began to shift its gaze. Nations that had once doubted the rebels now recognized the National Transitional Council as Libya's legitimate authority. Foreign embassies reopened in Benghazi. Funds frozen abroad were released to finance the revolution. In a matter of weeks, the rebels had gone from outlaws to representatives of a future state. But the war was far from clean. In the ruins of captured towns, revenge took hold. Suspected loyalists were beaten or executed without trial. Tribal rivalries resurfaced, each claiming its own piece of the revolution. Beneath the euphoria, Libya's old fractures began to stir. For every city liberated, another question emerged: what would hold this country together when Gaddafi was gone? The colonel, meanwhile, grew more isolated. His inner circle shrank to family members and a handful of die-hard loyalists. He moved constantly between bunkers, traveling at night through tunnels beneath Tripoli. His speeches, broadcast from unknown locations, echoed like messages from a vanishing world. "They want our oil," he cried. "They want to enslave us again." But the spell was broken. His empire of fear was cracking. In August, the rebels struck from two directions. Forces from Misrata advanced westward along the coast, while those from the Nafusa Mountains descended toward the capital. Between them, Gaddafi's defenses crumbled. Supply routes collapsed. Soldiers deserted. Even within Tripoli, secret cells of insurgents prepared to rise when the moment came. The war that began with protests and massacres was now approaching its climax. For the rebels, it was a final march toward freedom. For Gaddafi, the last desperate attempt to command the winds of history. The sound of artillery drew closer to the capital each day. The desert, once loyal and silent, now carried a different rhythm, the rhythm of retreat. As the summer sun bled into dusk, one could look across the Libyan sands and see the faint glow of fires stretching from the mountains to the sea. The old regime was collapsing in slow motion, its echoes fading into the night. And beyond those flames in the heart of Tripoli, the storm was gathering. The end came faster than anyone expected. In August 2011, Tripoli, the fortress city, the seat of Gaddafi's rule for 42 years, trembled under the weight of history. For months, its residents had lived in a haze of propaganda, and fear fed a steady diet of the colonel's defiance and the promise of victory. Yet the rumble of artillery in the distance told a different story. The revolution was closing in from every direction. From the west, the rebels of the Nafusa Mountains descended like a tide rolling across the plains toward the capital. From the east, fighters from Misrata, hardened by months of siege, pushed along the coastal highway, their battered trucks draped in the red, black, and green flag. In the skies above, NATO aircraft struck loyalist positions with surgical precision, severing roads and communications. Gaddafi's empire was being dismantled piece by piece. Inside Tripoli, fear curdled into chaos. Electricity flickered. Water ran dry. In the markets, prices tripled overnight. Soldiers patrolled the streets with haunted eyes, their loyalty eroding, as rumors spread that entire units were defecting. By mid-August, rebel agents within the city began to rise, staging small uprisings in key neighborhoods. They called their mission Operation Mermaid Dawn. The code name was poetic, almost mocking a reference to Tripoli's nickname, the Bride of the Sea. On August 20th, the assault began. As darkness fell, explosions rippled through the city. Rebel convoys stormed in from multiple directions, their headlights piercing the smoke. From balconies, civilians shouted blessings, waving flags as gunfire erupted in the streets. The sound of celebration and battle mingled into one overwhelming roar. The loyalists fought desperately, but their resistance fractured. One of Gaddafi's own cousins, tasked with defending the city's approaches, ordered his men to stand down and defected to the rebels. In a single stroke, the road to Tripoli lay open. For 48 hours, the capital became a battlefield. The air was thick with dust, the scent of oil and cordite clinging to the wind. Black smoke rose from burning vehicles. Across Green Square, renamed Martyrs Square by the rebels' crowds, surged in triumph. They trampled over the green flags of the regime, chanting, Allahu Akbar, Libya is free. Television cameras captured the moment as if history itself demanded witnesses. And yet amid the jubilation, Tripoli was a city unmoored. Looters swarmed the palaces of the elite. Prisons burst open, releasing both political captives and hardened criminals. The streets echoed with gunfire long after victory had been declared. At Bab al-Azizia, Gaddafi's sprawling fortress, rebels found his opulent tents shredded and empty the walls scrawled with graffiti. Here the tyrant slept. They fired their rifles into the air and tore down his golden statue, a giant fist crushing a fighter jet. It was the symbol of his defiance against America, now lying in pieces beneath their boots. But the man himself was gone. In the confusion of the city's fall, Gaddafi had slipped away, vanishing into the labyrinth of tunnels beneath the compound. Some said he fled south toward his birthplace of Sirte. Others claimed he hid in the desert with a convoy of loyalists. For the first time in 4 decades, Libya had no master. As night fell over, the liberated capital, bonfires burned on street corners. Families embraced in disbelief, children waving flags as if the mere act could hold the future together. In one square, a group of fighters unfurled a massive banner. The blood of our martyrs has not been spilled in vain. Yet beneath the celebration ran an undercurrent of unease. The dictator was gone, but the state he had built, rigid, personal, and absolute, had vanished with him. In its place stood a vacuum filled with hope and uncertainty. The next morning, the sun rose over Tripoli for the first time without Gaddafi's shadow. Smoke still hung in the air, and the city bore the scars of war, but the mood was electric, a mixture of disbelief, triumph, and the haunting silence of something enormous ending. For some it was liberation. For others, the beginning of a reckoning. Somewhere beyond the city limits, a convoy of battered vehicles sped into the desert. Inside one of them, the man who had once called himself the brother leader was already planning his last stand. The road to Sirte was lined with ghosts. Burned-out convoys, abandoned weapons, and the remains of battles fought and lost marked the colonel's retreat. Once a symbol of Gaddafi's glory, a planned utopia on the Mediterranean coast, Sirte had become his refuge and final prison. Here, among the windswept ruins of his dreams, the man who had ruled Libya for 42 years would face his end. By September 2011, the war had shrunk to a single front. The rebels, flush with victory in Tripoli, advanced on Sirte from east and west. Their ranks swelled with fighters from every corner of the country, Misrata veterans hungry for revenge, mountain tribes seeking justice, and young men who had known nothing but Gaddafi's shadow their entire lives. Above them, NATO jets circled ceaselessly, mapping loyalist defenses, striking when necessary, ensuring there would be no escape. Inside the besieged city, Gaddafi's loyalists dug in. Tanks were buried nose first in sand dunes to serve as stationary guns. Streets were mined. Apartment blocks were turned into sniper nests. For Gaddafi, this was no longer about victory, it was about defiance. The last gesture of a man who refused to accept that history had moved on without him. He still gave orders from hiding, speaking through crackling radios and loyal intermediaries. To the end, he believed himself chosen by fate. "I am still in your hearts," he told his followers. "Do not surrender. Fight for me. Fight for Libya." But the city around him was crumbling. Electricity failed, water ran out, and food became scarce. Civilians, those who had not already fled, huddled in basements, praying the shelling would pass them by. By early October, Sirte was encircled. The rebels' artillery pounded the city day and night. NATO airstrikes cut off every route of retreat. When rebel columns finally entered the outskirts, they found a wasteland. Every building was shattered, every street cratered. Still, Gaddafi's diehards fought on with suicidal resolve. In the chaos, old grudges flared. Misrata's fighters, remembering the horrors of their own siege, showed no mercy. Amid the ruins, Gaddafi hid in a network of tunnels near District 2, surrounded by his guards, his sons Mutassim and Saif al-Islam, and a dwindling circle of loyalists. He refused offers to flee by sea or surrender to the United Nations. Pride and delusion fused into one conviction that destiny could still be bent to his will. "Libya is not finished," he muttered, pacing in the half-dark. "They will see." But destiny had already decided. On the morning of October 20th, a convoy of vehicles attempted to break out of Sirte, racing west along the coastal road. NATO aircraft spotted the movement and struck. Missiles tore through the columns, setting cars ablaze. Survivors scattered into a drainage culvert, a narrow, filthy tunnel lined with concrete. Among them was the colonel himself, wounded and dazed, clutching a golden pistol. Moments later, rebel fighters from Misrata arrived. What happened next was chaos. They dragged Gaddafi from the culvert, blood streaming down his face, his once pristine robes soaked with mud. Some shouted for justice, others for vengeance. Videos captured on shaky phones showed the dictator pleading confused as blows rained down. A shot was fired, then another. Within minutes, the man who had ruled with fear for a generation lay dead on the roadside he had once ordered paved. His body was loaded into a pickup truck, paraded through the streets of Misrata, and displayed in a cold storage room for 3 days as crowds lined up to see him. Some prayed, others spat, most simply stared. It was not triumph they felt, but disbelief that the figure who had haunted their lives could end so small, so mortal. Sirte fell soon after. The green flags were torn down, replaced by the colors of the revolution. Gaddafi's golden statues were reduced to rubble. His palaces looted, his bunkers sealed. The war was over, or so the world believed. But as his convoy burned under the desert sun, the seeds of a new struggle were already taking root. The man was gone, yet his absence would haunt Libya like a ghost. The desert wind swept through the ruins of Sirte, scattering ash and silence. History, indifferent as ever, moved on. When the guns finally fell silent, Libya stood in a stunned and fragile dawn. For the first time in more than 4 decades, the country was free without a monarch, without a colonel, without a single man to command it. The world hailed the moment as a victory of people over tyranny, a triumph of courage against oppression. But within Libya, the silence after the storm felt uncertain, uneasy, like a vast desert waiting to be crossed. The National Transitional Council, the NTC, assumed control, promising order, democracy, and reconciliation. Its members spoke the language of hope, national unity, reconstruction elections. On state television, the new leaders appeared in plain clothes, sitting before the tricolor flag that had become the revolution's symbol. This is a new beginning, they declared, a new Libya built by its people. Across the nation, the euphoria was real. Streets once echoing with gunfire now filled with celebration. Families returned to homes abandoned during the war. Schools reopened under bullet-pocked walls. In Misrata, survivors carried portraits of the fallen through ruins still smelling of smoke. In Benghazi, fireworks burst above Martyrs Square, where the revolution had first begun. For a fleeting moment, the country felt united not by tribe, not by fear, but by shared sacrifice. The international community rushed to embrace the new Libya. Western nations reopened embassies, unfroze billions in oil revenues, and sent advisors to help rebuild. Aid convoys rolled in. Foreign companies eyed contracts to repair pipelines and refineries. For the first time in decades, the world saw Libya not as a pariah, but as a partner. And within the country, a fever of optimism spread. For the first time since independence, Libyans spoke freely in public squares. Newspapers bloomed overnight. Radio hosts debated politics without fear. In the streets of Tripoli, young men who had fought in the revolution now strutted in mismatched uniforms, calling themselves brigades. They saw themselves as guardians of the new republic. The NTC called them heroes, but heroes once armed are not easily governed. In July 2012, Libya held its first free election in generations. Turnout was astonishing, lines stretching for blocks under the summer sun. Elderly men who had never voted before wept as they dipped their fingers in ink. Women in headscarves and denim stood side by side, waving flags. "We are building our future," said one man, his voice trembling. For that single day, Libya felt reborn. The results brought a coalition of moderates to power, a parliament meant to replace the NTC and guide the country toward democracy. Around the world, leaders praised the Libyan miracle. Commentators called it proof that the Arab Spring could succeed. The revolution had not only overthrown a dictator, it had birthed a republic. Yet beneath the surface, cracks were already spreading. The militias that had fought for liberation refused to disarm. Each city, each tribe, each faction claimed its own martyrs and its own right to rule. The NTC lacked the power to enforce unity. Its authority existed more on paper than in the streets. Every checkpoint, every government building was guarded by men with rifles, but no chain of command. In Tripoli, optimism collided with reality. Ministries squabbled over oil contracts and cabinet seats. Former rebels demanded payment and recognition. Ordinary citizens, exhausted by war, grew restless as fuel shortages returned and power flickered. The revolution had promised dignity, but the chaos of its aftermath tested even the faithful. Still, in those first months of freedom, the dream endured. Artists painted murals over bullet holes, children played in courtyards once patrolled by secret police, and for the first time in decades, the call to prayer rose without the echo of Gaddafi's image behind it. The air was heavy with possibility, and with the ghosts of what might yet go wrong. Libya's future was a blank page, and everyone wanted to write upon it. Some dreamed of democracy. Others dreamed of power. But for now, amid the ruins and the noise, a single fragile truth seemed to hold: the revolution had not been in vain. For the first time in living memory, Libya belonged to its people. Hope, like the desert sun, fades quickly when unprotected. By 2013, the euphoria of Libya's revolution had begun to crack under the weight of its own promise. The dictator was gone, but his absence had left a void, a vacuum so vast that no single voice could fill it. Power once concentrated in the hands of one man had splintered into 1,000 rifles and rival councils. The state that Gaddafi had ruled absolutely had vanished completely. Every city became its own kingdom. In Misrata, the militias that had endured months of siege now saw themselves as the true guardians of the revolution. In Benghazi, Islamist brigades, once allies against the regime, demanded a new Libya governed by religious law. In the western mountains, tribal councils rearmed to settle old scores. Each faction spoke of unity, but carried its own flag. The dream of one Libya was dissolving into the noise of many Libyas, each shouting over the other. The new government, elected with such hope in 2012, found itself powerless. Ministers came and went, prime ministers were threatened, even kidnapped by armed groups demanding concessions. Parliament sessions turned chaotic, sometimes violent. The same young fighters who had once toppled a dictator now surrounded the capital with anti-aircraft guns, forcing politicians to obey at gunpoint. Democracy, fragile and new, was being smothered by the revolution's own children. In Benghazi, the birthplace of the uprising disillusionment ran deep. Once hailed as the cradle of freedom, the city descended into lawlessness. Car bombings became routine. Rival militias fought over police stations and supply depots. Civilians learned to avoid open roads. In September 2012, tragedy struck when the U.S. consulate was attacked by extremists, killing Ambassador Christopher Stevens and 3 other Americans. The attack shocked the world and exposed how little control the central government truly had. Gaddafi had once ruled through fear. Now fear ruled without him. Weapons looted from his arsenals flooded the streets, arming not just militias but smugglers, jihadists, and tribesmen. The desert became a sea of guns, and the country's borders, once sealed tight, turned porous. Across the Sahel from Mali to Sudan, Libyan weapons reignited old wars. The revolution's fire had jumped the fence. Ordinary Libyans watched with growing despair. The promises of freedom, justice, dignity, opportunity had become tangled in chaos. Oil exports, the backbone of the economy, plummeted as pipelines were seized or sabotaged by competing factions. Banks ran out of cash. Electricity failed for days. Hospitals short on medicine treated gunshot victims by candlelight. "This is not what our sons died for," one mother said, standing amid the ruins of her home. Her voice carried the grief of a generation. By 2014, the country split once more. Rival parliaments claimed legitimacy, one in Tripoli, another in Tobruk. Former comrades now faced each other as enemies. Civil war returned not as a sudden explosion, but as a slow, grinding collapse. The revolution's heroes had become warlords. Its victories had curdled into stalemates. In the city's murals of martyrs began to fade, their colors dulled by time and dust. The faces that once inspired courage now seemed like reminders of a dream betrayed. Libya's streets, once alive with chants of freedom and Allahu Akbar, grew quiet again, not with peace, but exhaustion. The desert indifferent as ever watched. It had seen this before: empires rise, promises bloom and wither, and men mistake chaos for destiny. The revolution that began with fire and hope was now dissolving into the silence of disillusion. And yet amid the ruins, a few voices still whispered that freedom was worth the pain, that revolutions are not moments, but generations. But for now, as the smoke of gunfire mingled once more with the sand, Libya's long night was returning. The guns that had once thundered for freedom now echoed through a country lost to its own revolution. By the end of 2014, Libya had fallen into the pattern that haunts so many uprisings the moment after victory, when unity dies and memory fractures. The same streets that had celebrated Gaddafi's fall now hosted rival patrols, their flags fluttering in a wind heavy with dust and gunpowder. The dream of a new Libya, bright, defiant, and free, was fading into the desert haze. 2 governments claimed legitimacy. 2 armies marched under different names. Tripoli became a fortress for one faction, Tobruk a bastion for the other. The lines that divided them were not just political, they were tribal, regional, and ideological, drawn deep into the soil like scars. The revolution had devoured its children, and Libya's vast horizons once again became frontiers of suspicion. In the ruins of Sirte, where Gaddafi's body had fallen, a darker power began to take root. The chaos gave birth to opportunity for the desperate, the vengeful, and the fanatical. Militants claiming allegiance to the so-called Islamic State slipped into the void, seizing the dictator's hometown and declaring it their own. Black flags rose where green ones had once flown. Sirte, once the stage of Gaddafi's last stand, now belonged to a new tyranny. The world, which had once intervened to save Libya, now turned its gaze elsewhere. The headlines moved on. The embassies closed. For the people left behind, the promises of democracy had become the rubble beneath their feet. Farmers abandoned their land, teachers fled their classrooms, doctors left their hospitals empty. Each year the sands crept a little closer, swallowing roads and villages, as if the desert itself were reclaiming what had been borrowed from it. And yet, in that same silence, small lights endured. In Tripoli, a group of students opened a library in the ruins of a government office. In Benghazi, women's cooperatives began to rebuild clinics destroyed in the fighting. In Misrata, children painted over bullet holes with the colors of the revolution's flag. For them, freedom was not a slogan shouted in crowds. It was the stubborn refusal to surrender hope. Libya had always been a paradox, a land both ancient and new, united by faith, yet divided by tribe rich in oil, yet poor in peace. Its story is one of endurance, not victory, a reminder that revolutions do not end when dictators fall. They end when the people who rise against them learn to govern themselves, to reconcile memory with reality, and to hold the line between chaos and rebirth. Today, the desert remains unchanged and unbothered. The same wind that once carried the voices of rebellion now sweeps over abandoned tanks and silent cities. It whispers through palm groves and broken courtyards, erasing the footprints of soldiers and the banners of their causes. In its vastness, the hopes of millions seem small, yet still somewhere within that emptiness, the pulse of a nation endures. The Libyan Revolution was not the end of a story, but the beginning of one still being written. Its pages are stained with oil and blood, its sentences scattered across the sand. But the idea it carried that people can rise, that no ruler is eternal, remains flickering, fragile, alive. As the sun sinks over the horizon of Sirte, the last light glints off the rusted wreckage of war. For a moment the desert shines gold. Then the night returns, and with it, silence, endless patient watching as it always has.